And welcome to the Watchman. Well, the terrorist army ISIS has conquered a large amount of territory in the very heart of the Middle East. Its new caliphate stretches across parts of Iraq and Syria. But for a lot of Americans, ISIS came out of nowhere. So how did ISIS get established? Who is this group and where did they come from? We're joined today by Michael Rubin to discuss it. Michael is a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute here in Washington. He travels to Iraq frequently. He's a former Pentagon official, and his newest book is called Dancing with the Devil, The Perils of Engaging Rogue Regimes. Michael, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thank you, Eric. It's great to talk with you.
Always great to be with you. Like I said in the lead-in, Michael, a lot of Americans, I heard from a lot of people who said, wow, where did these guys come from? When ISIS stormed Mosul back in June, and even when they stormed into Anbar province back in January, should this have been a surprise to Americans, or had this been brewing for some time?
Well, let me make this analogy. Of course, ISIS has its roots in al-Qaeda in Iraq, and it's an al-Qaeda offshoot, but they've really developed in Syria, and we've known it's a problem. It's almost as if President Obama was a doctor who diagnosed cancer at stage 1 and then deliberated for several years as it metastasized to stage 4, and now we're talking about whether or not we need to give the patient an aspirin or not.
Yeah, so this, as you said, this really began as al-Qaeda in Iraq. Talk about that progression, Michael, how we went from AQI to ISIS. You know, obviously the surge under George W. Bush really put the pressure on al-Qaeda in Iraq, and they were largely defeated, it seemed like. How did al-Qaeda in Iraq rise from the ashes and become ISIS?
Well, you know, it's a very good question, Eric. A lot of people in the United States, especially in the State Department, want to root the rise of ISIS in grievance. They want to blame Baghdad, that if only Prime Minister Maliki had been more generous to the Sunni community, that ISIS wouldn't exist the way it does today. Unfortunately, that's nonsense. We need to recognize that ISIS is motivated ideologically. Now, they pushed back into Syria, and there were some disputes, especially after the death of Osama bin Laden, as various al-Qaeda affiliates sought to compete with each other. There's a competition within Syria between what became the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria and the Nusra Front. The Nusra Front remains much more tied to al-Qaeda Central. ISIS, in a way, has become too radical even for them. They're not willing to play by al-Qaeda's rules, and they therefore seek to establish the Caliphate now and in any countries they can acquire.
Michael, you've been on the ground in Iraq frequently. You know the territory, you know the country so well. How disastrous was it for President Obama to withdraw U.S. troops back in 2011? Should we have seen what's happening now? Should we have seen it coming with no U.S. troops there?
I think we should have. And in fact, I wrote it in the Wall Street Journal at the time. But here's where I think President Obama went wrong. President Obama doesn't understand the purpose of the American military, Eric. He sees it as an arrow in our quiver in which to engage in wars of choice. He doesn't understand that American military power has always been the proverbial finger in the dike, preventing a deluge of chaos. Now, if you create a vacuum, it's not going to be the altruistic forces that fill it. It was the vacuum we created that allowed ISIS to take root. Just like in Afghanistan, it was the vacuum we created that allowed al-Qaeda to take root.
So al-Qaeda in Iraq, which became ISIS, Michael, really after we withdrew, really it seems started to reconstitute itself. There were waves of suicide bombings in Iraq in 2012, 2013. Talk about that. After U.S. troops left, talk about how al-Qaeda in Iraq became strong once again and the monster that we see now in the form of ISIS.
Well, Eric, you know I go back to Iraq every 3 or 4 months, and one thing that really struck me, as the Americans were debating whether or not we should give arms to the Syrian opposition, when I would travel to Iraq, at first I would meet with people, including Prime Minister Maliki, and he would say, no, you Americans are making a mistake by supporting the Syrian opposition. You don't realize how radical they are. But in more recent years, from around 2009, it wasn't only Prime Minister Maliki or other Shiites, maybe their concerns could be dismissed because of sectarian interests, but it was also the Iraqi Christians and even the Iraqi Sunnis who were saying, you guys are playing with fire and you don't realize it. Now, I was in Mosul and Tikrit earlier this year. I was being warned by special forces, both Sunni, Iraqi special forces, both Sunni and Shiite, not to go into the city because it was so dangerous. And Iraqis brought me in, they vouched for me, but the fact of the matter is you saw all these Syrian refugees glowering on the street corners, and it really was the Iraqis who saw this coming, but the Americans turned a deaf ear because we didn't just retreat physically, we retreated mentally as well.
Michael, talk about the role Syria played in the Syrian conflict, the Syrian civil war. Talk about the role that played in strengthening ISIS and kind of bringing them to where they are now.
Well, first of all, we need to recognize that Bashar al-Assad is also to blame. There's a tendency throughout the Middle East to support jihadism. And some of these dictators who make themselves seem secular will support jihadism so long as it's for export only.
Like Assad and Hezbollah.
Exactly. Yeah. But in this case, if you go back to 2007, U.S. forces captured something in Iraq called a laptop, and we named this document trove the Sinjar documents. And what it was a whole catalog of all the suicide bombers and foreign fighters who had come into Iraq. Which ones were Egyptians, which ones were Libyan, which ones were Saudis. But they had one thing in common. They were all transiting Syria. But with Bashar al-Assad's knowledge, he was willing to deal with the jihadis so long as they were killing the Americans. Yeah. He didn't count on the blowback. What worries me now is how does ISIS get into Syria and Iraq? Through Turkey. President Erdogan in Turkey is going to experience the same sort of blowback.
Yeah, and you've written a lot about Turkey, Michael, and kind of the Islamist government there. They're supposed to be a U.S. ally, as is Qatar, which has also had a hand in funding groups like Hamas, and some would say a hand in supporting ISIS. How can we put pressure on Turkey right now? Because as you said, a supposed NATO ally have clearly taken a turn for the worse. How can we pressure them to stop that flow of ISIS types, Jabhat al-Nusra types, who, as you said, are transiting from Turkey into Syria? What can we do to kind of pressure Erdogan to put a stop to that?
You know, Albert Einstein defined insanity, Eric, as doing the same action repeatedly but expecting different results each time. What we see now in Turkey has really become Pakistan on the Mediterranean. Just like Pakistan was playing a double game when it came to al-Qaeda and other militants, that's what Turkey is doing now. Now with Pakistan, our diplomats always wanted to be diplomatic. They didn't want to call a spade, and we paid the price for it. It's time not to make the same mistake. It would be crazy to make the same mistake when it comes to Turkey. And putting diplomacy aside, the way Turkey is acting is it's acting as if it were a state sponsor of terrorism. We should not hesitate to put all our diplomatic and economic and political pressure on Turkey we can, because every single jihadi, they may come from dozens of different countries, with one thing they have in common is they're all transiting through Istanbul's airport.
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting, Michael, because you talk about blowback with Assad. You can see it happening to Turkey as well. ISIS has made clear that they want to expand this mini caliphate that they've established in the heart of the Middle East. How much battlefield experience and invaluable battlefield experience did ISIS gain in Syria during the Civil War?
Oh, well, without doubt. What Afghanistan was in the 1980s, and Chechnya became in the 1990s, and Iraq became in the last decade, that's Syria today. Many of these people have gained significant experience, if not on the battlefield, then in crafts like bomb making and other sorts of terrorism. We see this with regard to Jihad John, who's been beheading American journalists on video.
A British citizen, apparently.
Exactly. So certainly there has been this degree of knowledge. Syria has become a petri dish. Unfortunately, we saw it coming, and during President Obama's first term, you had Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, CIA Director David Petraeus, and others say, Secretary of Defense Bob Gates, all say, we need to put a stop to this, but Obama hemmed and hawed, and now we have what we have.
Michael, thanks so much. Always great to have your expertise, my friend.
Thanks.
The book is called Dancing with the Devil, The Perils of Engaging Rogue Regimes. Pick it up, and much more coming up after the break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, Anjem Choudary has been called Great Britain's most hated man. Some would say he's Great Britain's most dangerous man. Choudary is very open about his support for jihad and the fact that he'd like to see Great Britain and the world ruled by Islamic Sharia law. Now, some of Chowdary's former followers have been convicted on terrorism charges, and the groups that he has led, including Al-Muhajirun, have been banned under the UK's counter-terrorism laws. I've interviewed him face-to-face before on his home turf of London, as you've seen in previous episodes of The Watchman, and I hooked up with him again recently to discuss the rise of ISIS. As you might imagine, Anjem Choudary was very open about his support for the new caliphate. Take a look. I want to ask you about Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Do you consider his claim as caliph to be legitimate, and do your followers and people you speak to consider his Islamic State to be legitimate? Is this the return of the caliphate that I've spoken to you about this for 5-6 years now. Is this the return of the caliphate, the Islamic State that you've dreamed about?
Well, first of all, the propaganda that was mentioned earlier, I have a different perspective from people on the ground. They're very happy that basic needs of food, clothing, and shelter are being met. They have security. They never had
So
it
the
so good.
Christians and
They've gone
Yazidis
free.
are happy. They're
Well,
happy.
wait a second. The Yazidis are embracing Islam, for your information, Eric. You
At
don't
the,
want
at
to
the point of
believe.
a sword, Anjem.
Well, no, it's not true, Ashi. It's not
It's
true.
not?
They're queuing up. They're embracing Islam. I
Okay.
know that many Christians won't be
No
happy, but the
compulsion
Christians
there.
are becoming Muslim as well. They're queuing up to live under the Sharia. The problem that we have, Eric, is that, things like Frankenstein and Dracula are invented, and then people start believing those things. And this is the sad reality. You begin to believe your own propaganda.
Yeah,
In the
but
Second
ISIS
World
is
War, they
tweeting
said the
out pictures
Germans
of
were eating
severed
babies,
heads.
and they weren't.
It's all
But I mean,
there.
in war, there are very gruesome things, and obviously some of the people who've been killed have been executed after there have been trials. But let me just say the following: in terms of the Islamic State, the basic needs are being met. The structure is there in terms of the caliph, his assistants, the governors in the areas, the judges. You can see from many clips that they've completely eradicated all of the vices, in that particular area. And by all accounts, I cannot see any reason why the people would not accept Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi as the Caliph. And I believe this is Khilaf al-Rashida ala minhaj al-Nubuwah, meaning the rightly guided Khalifa along the lines of prophethood, from the information that I have, not from the information that you have.
So you have been accused in the British media of recruiting for ISIS, and that some of your followers have actually gone to Syria to join with this group. How do you respond to that?
Well, nobody's actually gone to date to Syria or Iraq, having informed me beforehand. I mean, I've discovered that there are some people there, and by all accounts, the people who are there, who I know, are just living there as citizens. They've decided that they want to live under the Sharia. They want to experience the Islamic State. They want to bring up their children according to Islam. Before the 29th of June, people were going there for humanitarian reasons. Obviously, people were going to fight against Bashar al-Assad and the Nusayris and the Iraqi regime, who by all accounts have been raping and pillaging and been very brutal. But after the 29th of June, after the establishment of the Khilafah, I think you find now that the people are flocking there because they want to live under the Sharia. Remember, you have now a state there. There are millions of people living there, Christians, non-Muslim, Jews, Muslims, even Yazidis, who are living there. Their basic needs are being protected. The basic needs are being provided. Their security is there. So I think there's different reasons why people are going there. Not everybody is going there, and learning how to fight and then wanting to return, to the West, which is what people like Cameron and Obama would have you believe.
Yeah. So you would encourage Muslims to go to the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq?
I think that the Muslims should worship Allah wherever they are in the world, And I'm here in Britain. I worship Allah as best as I can here. If I was in America, I'd do the same. I don't believe that anybody should be restricted from traveling anywhere in the world. So if they want to go, that's their choice. I'm not buying plane tickets for them. Nobody's asking me if they want to go abroad. The problem that you have in the West is that, you cannot decide who's a freedom fighter and who's a terrorist. Sheikh Osama bin Laden was a freedom fighter. People were loving him in the West. And then when he fought against the Americans, he's a terrorist. So your definition of terrorism changes depending on which way the wind's blowing. So it's not the same. We have divine law. Our own actions are guided by the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They don't change every day depending on what the government says.
So you believe...
Today in Britain, if you want to travel abroad to Syria, you'll be arrested at the airport. Your passport will be taken. You'll be citizenless. You'll be treated as a terrorist. You're guilty until proven otherwise. That would never happen to a white Englishman called John or Bob. It only happens to Muhammad and Abdul Rahman.
Well, what about Richard Dart, who is a follower of yours, a white Englishman who converted to Islam and then was convicted on terror charges?
Well, I wouldn't read too much into that, Eric. Nowadays, if you don't plead guilty, you're going to be found guilty anyway by a biased jury. The courts are biased, the police are biased, the Crown Prosecution Service is biased. He's going to face 40 or 50 years in prison, because, there's no way of him being found innocent, even though I believe he's innocent. I don't believe he did anything wrong at all. But the problem is that, you have plea bargaining nowadays, and there's absolutely no chance of getting a fair trial and being found innocent. People are given choice between 5 or 10 years in prison or 30 or 40 years in prison. Really, they're choosing the lower one. That doesn't mean that they're guilty.
Anjem, to listen to you, it sounds like you believe Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the Islamic State, al-Baghdadi, people like Richard Dart have been convicted on terrorism charges. Pretty compelling evidence in my view. It seems like you believe these entities, these individuals, these organizations have done nothing wrong, and they are Islamically mandated to do what they're doing. Is that a fair statement?
Well, I would say to you, Eric, that you've got to look at these things from an Islamic perspective. There's no doubt that people make mistakes. Every son of Adam makes mistakes, and the best among them are those who ask forgiveness and they correct themselves. So, there's no doubt that mistakes have been made in the battlefield. Maybe some innocent people here and there have been killed. But at the end of the day, there's a war taking place, Eric, and people kill each other in war. They don't make love. There are action and there's reaction. And so what I say to you is that if we want to change the world and we want to make it a better place, then you've got to stop supporting the dictators in Muslim countries. You got to stop, preventing Muslims to implement the Sharia and living by what they believe. How ironic is it that the West always says to people like me and others, if you want Sharia, go back home. And now that the people want to go back home and implement the Sharia, they say, well, if you go, we'll arrest you and take away your passport.
Up next, are we at war with Islamic jihadists? Anjem Choudary says we are. Much more on that after the break. And welcome back. Here's more from my recent interview with the UK's most notorious Islamist, Anjem Choudary. I want to ask you about Sharia. Now, your push has been for Sharia in the UK, in Belgium, across Europe, and the US. Do you feel like you're making inroads in Europe?
Well, Islam, as you may know, is the fastest growing ideology and religion in the whole of Europe, indeed in the whole world.
It's interesting that you call it an ideology.
Well, I say that because Islam is a deen. Deen means a complete way of life. It's not a spiritual belief like, Christianity or Judaism or Buddhism. It's not something that is just resigned, to the church or the synagogue or the temple. It has its own ruling system, a political system. It has a spiritual basis, but it's a complete package. And the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was the final messenger for the whole of mankind. So I invite you and your listeners, and to embrace Islam. Islam is for the whole of humanity. It has solutions for everything. And you can see that the call for the Sharia is very rich and it's very prominent in the whole of Europe. In Belgium, I've been to Belgium. I was invited to an anti-democratic festival, in fact, recently in Denmark by Christians, who are looking at alternatives to capitalism and liberal democracy. I think the Occupy phenomenon recently has shown that people don't believe that the system we have nowadays provides their basic needs, protects them, gives them, some kind of ambition. Our youth have no ambition. There's widespread unemployment and crime. We're looking for an alternative. And I would say that Islam is that alternative. Communism is dead. Capitalism is dying. Islam is the future, I believe, for mankind.
Yeah. In terms of the state ISIS is setting up, would you yourself be interested in living there? If that is your ideal vision of what the world should look like, the Sharia is being applied?
Eric, if I could go there tomorrow, I'd be there with my family, with my wife, my children, my mother, my brother, my sister, everybody, really, my whole tribe. I'd love to live there. I'd love to bring my children up according to the Sharia. What I'm hearing firsthand is completely different, obviously, from what you know. But people are so happy. They've got basic needs. They've got free houses. Gas, electricity, water, etc. is free of charge. I mean, nobody in the world really has this at the moment. We're living in times, in Britain and even in America, the countries with the largest GDP, where people don't have security for their homes. The whole life they just work and they can't even pay. Their basic income does not meet their everyday living expenses, and yet it's a completely different scenario over there. People are very happy. I would like to live in a society like that.
The interesting thing is that in that society, you and I could not have this conversation, this open.
Oh, of course we could. We could, of course.
I'd lose my head.
We can have a debate.
Literally.
Eric, when I'm there, I may well be there one day. You can come down. We'll have a debate. Why not? And I believe just
I'd leave with my head, huh?
No, Eric. Look, there are people obviously who are citizens. Their life, their wealth, etc. is protected, and of course there are people fighting. And you don't want to paint everybody with the same brush. People die in war. And it's very gruesome. How many people have been beheaded by drones?
It is a war. I think it's fascinating that you acknowledge. You acknowledge this is a war, because some Western leaders say, "Look, this is just a criminal action." There's
a war taking place.
There's a war taking place.
Yeah, and I can tell you, if you look at the facts, I was reading the other day, I think there are up to 1,000 people who are joining, the Islamic State's army every single day. And these people look down the barrel of a gun, they see paradise. They love to die the way that, you and others love to live. You cannot defeat people like that, and I believe that this army will grow much stronger because the regimes in Muslim countries are so weak. They're so unjust. They're implementing so much oppression. I think it will spread very, very quickly. The Muslim world will be united very quickly. And then I think you will have a superpower unparalleled in the world. After that, I believe it will be easy to annex many other countries like China and Russia and even America one day.
This is a long-term vision, huh?
Well, I think it's a short-term vision, actually, Eric. I think these things will happen rapidly. Regime change is something which has become quite an easy phenomenon for those people under the Islamic State nowadays.
Coming up, why America needs to get on war footing against radical jihadists and fast. That's coming up after the break. And welcome back. The Obama administration has treated the war against radical Islam and jihad as sort of a criminal action and not a war. They're trying terrorists in civilian courts. They'd like to do away with the military tribunals at Guantanamo Bay and shut Gitmo down. Now, you heard Anjem Choudary in our interview. Radical Islamists, jihadists, are at war against the United States. Yet the Obama administration can't seem to decide if it's at war with the worst of those jihadists, ISIS. We've seen the President, Secretary of State John Kerry, and other administration officials mumble and bumble when they're asked if we are at war with ISIS. Well, folks, the first rule of war is to know your enemy. Anjem Choudary says we are at war, and if we don't acknowledge that, very soon we're going to be in big, big trouble. We may not know the enemy right now, unfortunately, but I can assure you the enemy knows us and knows our weaknesses. Time to step up and acknowledge we are in a war for our very survival. Well, that's it for the Watchman this week. Thanks for joining us, and until next week, God bless you, and remember, never hold your peace.